Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Optimising Running Performance webinar presented by Össur. Thank you for having me today. We will get started and hopefully we get some questions at the end of the presentation. And please feel free to pop those into the question box at any time throughout the webinar. So we're going to talk about running today. It's supposed to be easy and fluent and fun, but for many of us, it ends up being quite a challenge to do it well. And it's also really challenging to get into running initially and to stay injury-free. Running has a high rate of overuse injuries and structural injuries to muscular, tendon and skeletal structures. Kids tend to run all day and they run well naturally, but often somewhere along the way things go wrong and we need to find a refresh button and hit that in order to recorrect and reset ourselves so that we can run naturally, efficiently and effectively. And we're going to talk about some of those strategies today. The two main areas that I see that lead us to poor running economy or poor running efficiency can be broken into mechanical and to technical areas. The mechanical side of the error box, things like range of motion become compromised through either aging, contractures, dehydration, injury, surgery, those kind of things. Pain, shin splints are common, strength issues and strength deficits through the gluteals or through the hamstrings and quads or calf muscles become issues. Innervation, so the ability to fire and contract the muscles, injury and illness, and also in an amputee environment, the equipment that we use and the choices of equipment that we make and how that equipment might be set up and also interfere with how efficient we are as a runner. From the technical side of things, the technical side of the box for me is around our understanding. It's about the concepts and the thought processes that we have and how we believe we should run. So these things that we might have been given as cues to improve our running, the language that's often talked about on television or in magazines around running. So these are really the inputs either from our own internal thinking or from the external influence of others that influence the technical aspects of how we believe we should be running. And both of these cause us some issues when it comes to running well. Looking at a couple of the mechanical drains, this is where I first start in addressing running for clients or for athletes or amputees. And I guess this is just looking out for where energy and effort are being wasted. And often the first port of call for me to correct or to look for is poor posture. We want to see lovely posture. We want to see really nice spinal alignment. We want to see nice, tall and erect posture. We want to see good lines of our spinal curves intact and particularly for me, things like pelvis position and where that is aligned to the rest of our body. Co-contraction is another issue that comes up quite often, and this is where tightness and stiffness can prevent one muscle group relaxing while the other one is contracting, and that can cause a mechanical inefficiency within the muscle tissue or between muscle groups. Range of motion, sometimes too much is just as bad as too little. Running really needs to have a bit of stiffness about it. It doesn't want to be too placid and floppy and low tone, but we don't want to be overly tight and tense either. Counterproductive lateral and rotational movements are the other things that are really common that we'll see when people move and people run, and we see a lot of rotational movements or a lot of lateral deviation at the hip in single leg stance, and these things create energy and effort being utilized in an opposite direction to forward momentum or forward movement. Strength deficits through the glutes, through the muscles affecting the trunk, so to create a nice strong trunk posture. So the core, I guess as it's commonly termed, are also really common, and also I guess strength deficits in the calf muscle and the gastrocnemius and the soleus muscles that really, I guess, inhibit an athlete's ability to provide force and strength throughout various speeds of running. Poor coordination is also a factor. People having a limited ability or knowledge of where their body is in space, so some proprioceptive knowledge there, can also impact on their alignment and their understanding of how they feel when they run. As we get older, our muscle types and fiber type changes a little bit, and so sometimes this is the rate of force development, the ability to produce large amounts of force in a small time period or ground contact time is also impacted. Our energy system capacities, and I guess this refers to the ability to sustain an output of energy for a period of time, and that might be in a 100-meter sprint being able to maintain 100% effort and energy production over a 10 to 15 second capacity, or it might be the ability to run a marathon in 4 hours and to sustain that aerobic output over that period of time and the muscular strength that's required underneath that. So often we see energy systems limiting our ability to run as well. Central nervous system and peripheral innervation and fatigue. So these are things that can be trained, our ability to fire muscles and fire them rapidly or to sustain a neural output to our muscle tissue over a longer period of time, which ends up creating fatigue. And I guess these things that can be trained as well. But they're often deficits initially before training starts that may inhibit somebody's ability to sustain an effective and efficient running mechanic. And we're seeing in the research that mental focus is a big indicator and a big influence on fatigue these days. So the ability to push through a little bit of uncomfortableness and or a bit of pain, or when it gets hard to keep going, mental toughness can cause us to either improve our running or to decline in our running. So posture. So posture for me is the position from which all movement begins and ends. It's quite sport specific, and it's also really specific to, I guess, the direction of travel, the forces that are acting on the body, and the intensity of the effort that's required. So if you're only performing something and you're going for a walk, well, you don't need as much core strength and trunk posture strength as what you would if you were sprinting at 100% effort. So a runner's posture really needs to be rock solid. There are similarities that we see across sports, and generally we only see some minor variations. And those variations, for me, aren't really about the alignment of the posture, but what we see is the alignment to the ground, or the alignment to the direction of travel that actually change. Amputees in particular must be super strong and really stable. Bilateral differences between left and right really impact on the rotational requirements of running, and to be strong through the trunk and core and pelvis to maintain a solid and nice and square trunk position. So we see shoulders nice and square to hips nice and square, and keeping this rectangle in shape throughout the running action is really critical to good outcomes. Excuse me. So the sprinting posture, if we think about sprinting as being our 10 out of 10 running, and I guess then if anything we do below that speed of maximal effort, being a 6 out of 10 or a 3 out of 10 down to marathons or going for a jog around the park, then I guess we start with our 10 out of 10 posture, and everything from there is just watered down a little bit slightly as we go down the chain of running or sprinting speed and posture. But the key things that I look for and that we see when we look at sprinting posture is we start to see in good sprinters the alignment of the shoulders and pelvis being parallel. So we see here nice shoulder position parallel with the hips and the pelvis. And we've got this really beautiful, strong line of drive where we're getting through toe here, roughly about the center of knee, center of hip, center of shoulder, and the center of the ear. And this line of drive is really what creates the direction of travel and the direction and summation of forces. And the very good runners, we will see what generally starts to happen at critical moments throughout the running action at the end of range in the arms and the legs as they start to travel from forward to backward. We start to see some of these angles and limbs lining up with this line of drive. So we've got forearms here lining up beautifully and some mating forces to this line of trajectory, and also the front shin angles as well, starting to parallel that line of drive as well. Similarly over here, beautiful long strong line of drive from toe through knee, hip, shoulder and ear. Great symmetry and parallel lines through hips and shoulders, and then we start to see these forearms lining up and helping to create force along the same line of drive, and the front shin lining up with that as well. We also have a beautiful neutral spine. We've got maintaining nice spinal curves throughout the torso, and the head held in quite a neutral, nice and relaxed position. And really the key thing for sprinting and running is we want to develop our tension to hold the core and trunk and posture fixed, but then around that we want to allow these beautiful elastic and reactive and reflex movement through the legs and arms. So the tension is really being held throughout the trunk. It's our isometric stable base from which all of the limbs move and travel and traverse around. If we go and look at different sports, what for me is interesting to see is how this line of drive really does stay the same. Okay, we see force production occurring through this similar line of drive of ankle, knee, hip, shoulder and ear, or ankle, knee, hip and shoulder in this change of direction scenario. And then from that we also start to see some of the similarities of shin angles starting to line up with that line of drive, and we also start to see things like shoulders and pelvises staying in alignment in nice parallel posture and position as well. So in acceleration, we have very similar types of postures that we have in running. But we also get the same scenario occurring in deceleration or in force absorption. We see nice strong lines of drive to absorb force, and also strong lines through other limbs to absorb those forces along the line of drive as well. Range of movement is really necessary. It's really necessary because without it, if we don't have adequate range to perform the skills or the drills, then we are compromised, but also to improve our efficiency and our economy. As I mentioned briefly before, if we have tightness through the quadriceps, for example, then our ability to flex the knee is a little bit inhibited by that tightness through the quads. So the efficiency of that mechanism to flex the knee, or in this case here, if we are tight through the glutes, then we can't flex at the hip as well as we could, or as efficiently as we could. Range of movement is also really important, as we know, for injury prevention, and just to perform the requirements of the skills that may be necessary for correct movement in the sport itself. Mechanically, we also need the right leg for the right job. So this type of setup here is great for heading out, going out and enjoying yourself, but it's probably not going to help you to go down to the park and play a game of touch football. Likewise here, great for walking and great for running or changing direction and playing some team sports, and again for traveling out. But the right leg and the right setup really does influence our abilities to, in an amputee sense, to perform skills and the drills or the practice that we need. Technical drains is a big issue with how we teach and how we cue athletes. So the concepts of running that we know and that we read or that we've inherited along the way can really get in the way of how we run and what we think about running. So I want to start with this concept of speed equals stride length and stride frequency. Now, this has been around for generations, and it's really, most people understand this, that if I want to run faster, then I have to increase my stride length and or my stride frequency. And from this equation, what we often get is somebody trying to manipulate their stride length by reaching or overstriding, or they try to be quick with their movements and thinking that that will influence overall their speed. And I guess in a relationship sense, this is true and accurate, but only at a basic level. If we influence one, yes, we do get an increase in speed. If we increase the other, yes, we also get an increase in speed. But the relationship probably isn't as straightforward as what the equation is written. What we end up seeing in the research, and what the research tells us, is that stride length and stride frequency are reliant on speed, and that they are a consequence of the speed that you're traveling at, and not necessarily a cause to increase speed. In actual fact, Wayand, who's a researcher in Texas, he suggests that stride frequency varies little between sprinters and therefore has only a small determining factor on maximum velocity. However, increases in speed or horizontal velocity accurately create increases in both stride length and stride frequency. So stride length is improved through the distance traveled whilst in the air. So basically, if we're traveling faster, when we leave the ground, we travel further. So a little bit more sprint research. We know that sport and speed and running is both, your ability to do this is both controlled by nature and nurture. So it can be trained. We can make improvements, which is a positive thing. We can improve our running through practice and through training. Wayand also, through his research, looked at flight time, and he found that across varying speeds of running, flight time, or the time spent in the air, is relatively similar. And he also discovered that the frequency is capped, that there's a sort of a ceiling of around 5 strides per second across most top athletes. So there's really minimal differences there. Between 4.8 to 5 strides per second is sort of top range of stride frequency. The key and critical difference that he found was that top sprinters apply more vertical forces and vertical ground reaction forces, and that they do this very early in the contact or stance phase. So top running speeds are achieved by creating greater forces on the ground and not by increasing our leg turnover or our leg speed or our leg cadence. Some of the common cues and coaching errors that I hear and see across the last 20, 24 years of coaching, and I've been guilty of most of these myself, is teaching athletes about getting their knees up. And I'm sure we've all heard that if you want to run fast, you've got to get your knees up. My thoughts these days move towards now teaching athletes to put their foot down and to promote increasing their ground contact forces. The other key things that I really like to try and emphasize are pelvis position, making sure that they're in nice neutral tilt and that they're not anteriorly or forward tilt through their pelvis. And this is quite common that we see quite a large lordosis occurring through increased pelvic tilt. And what that does is just shift the alignment of our femur to our trunk, and we tend to over-rotate and over-push on the ground, and our feet get stuck and our legs get stuck behind us, and we're unable to achieve nice front-side mechanics. Overstriding then is a product of that. So as we push or lose our anterior or our pelvic tilt, and we start to get into pelvic tilt, and we start to get into anterior tilt, the foot then travels a little bit further on the ground. So that increases our ground time and our contact time on the ground, and then behind us, and then the opposite reaction to that in an equal and opposite reaction scenario is that if we push further and our foot's on the ground longer at the back, then we end up overreaching and overstriding on the opposite limb on the front to balance that action. And then we get stuck into this, what I call push-pull running, where we're pushing too far and too long on the back, and then we end up having to reach and put the foot in front of us and then pull ourselves forward from that foot contact, and we get this push-pull scenario. This over-pushing really does constrict us in terms of our flight time, or our flight height. So then we end up with our maximum velocity being compromised, or our constant speed running being compromised because we have increased rotations, we have lower hip height, and it just creates a lot more mechanical issues and incorrect loading. Incorrect limb recovery during the swing phase. So if there's a delay in the rear foot coming forward, so once we're at toe off in the running mechanics, and that rear trail knee doesn't, doesn't start to recover quickly, then we end up being delayed in our ability to improve our swing phase and get into another stride cycle earlier. No elasticity in the musculotendinous unit, so we want to always maintain elasticity within the skeletal structure. So collagen is a really big influence on our running ability. It allows us to have elasticity and give us energy for free. So we want to be able to maintain that nice posture and spine alignment and allow the limbs to move elastically around that. A lack of lateral hip strength and the ability to stabilize at the pelvis, so that we, in single leg stance, if we're getting lateral deviation or collapse at the knee or the hip or the foot, then these are the things that create lateral movements or rotational movements that impact on our ability to project and maintain our momentum forward. Cueing fast feet reduces our ability to spend time on the ground, and we actually need to spend time on the ground to generate our forces. So we actually, teaching somebody to have fast or to be quick really does reduce our ability to provide or have time on the ground to spend generating forces, and they often then won't generate as much force and therefore won't generate enough projection forward because of limited force to actually run well or improve their running. Pulling and clawing the foot on the front side mechanics is quite a common cue that some coaches use. I think this just overloads the hamstrings, and trying to pull the foot backwards at that phase of the running just really promotes overstriding and overstriking, and also risk of hamstring injury. I think a key thing to focus on when teaching running is quickness is not speed. We need both force and we need quickness to run fast. But quickness on its own does not equal speed. So for me, vertical ground reaction forces are the king. Knees up, and the cueing of knees up doesn't work. It creates this sort of sitting posture here. We've got a nice high knee, but it really does cause us to collapse and to lower our hip height, and then we lose some of our flight height and therefore stride length. So what happens when we start to teach people to push down on the ground and to get away from this knees up scenario and to focus on pushing on the ground is we see a greater influence of elasticity and spring, and we also see a beautiful postural alignment, because when we push harder on the ground, our posture must come into alignment to generate and support those forces that we're developing. So for me, one of the great cues that I use is just down, 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 and try and encourage athletes to get a sense of what it feels like to apply forces to the ground and generate ground reaction forces in the direction of travel. In early phase acceleration, as in this image here, on the far right, we are generating from a standing start an angle of about 50 degrees here, and from this we can see that the components here that we're using to generate this angle are relatively equal in horizontal vectors of force and also equal in vertical vectors of force. So as we're starting out in our running, we've got 50-50 contribution of horizontal and vertical forces. But as we get toward constant velocity running or maximum speed running, our posture and our position changes that we are quite upright. And the main forces that we need to be generating here are really just vertical ground reaction forces, or pushing down on the ground. And there's a little bit of wind resistance, a little bit of friction that we need to overcome, or air resistance that we need to overcome, but really the horizontal component of this posture and constant running constant running speed is quite small comparative to the vertical component. And simply, my belief is that we can generate this little horizontal component by simply having good posture and slightly leaning forward in the running action. Overstriding, I think, is one of the most common errors that we see in running, and I think it comes back to some of those cognitive processes that people have, that they think, oh, if I increase my stride length, then I'll run better and faster. But when we try to lengthen our stride by reaching, we actually lower our hip height and we slow ourselves down by increasing our braking forces. And the key thing to teach people and to change in their thinking is about projectile motion. So once we leave the ground at toe off and we travel into the air in the flight phase of running, we are a projectile in motion. And the things that influence us there are the height of release, so the height that we achieve at toe off through our pelvis and hips, the angle of our release, and the velocity of our release. And so simply now we can see that there's no need to increase our stride length by lengthening or reaching in the front side mechanics. The actual benefit of increasing our stride length comes from improving our velocity, our timing of release, the height of release, and the angle of that release. So it really comes down to a technical component and also about a force delivery component on the ground. One of the key things to efficiency when we run is about minimizing ground breaking forces. These sprinters here running 100 meters, foot contact here is about 10 to 15 centimeters in front of center of mass. Again, 10 to 15 centimeters in front of the hips and center of mass here, maybe about 20 centimeters here. And if this happens over 50 steps in a 100-meter race, we could be saving ourselves 1 to 2 meters of distance traveled by simply getting that foot closer and neater and tighter to our center of mass when we put it on the ground. So ground braking forces for me are like driving your car with one foot on the accelerator and pumping the brakes. So we speed up, we slow down, we speed up, we slow down, we speed up, we slow down. And it creates a lot higher energy use and a lot more inefficiencies in terms of continuing to accelerate or continuing to maintain velocity. So foot contact really needs to fall under hips or under the center of mass. These two examples here show. So beautiful position here of foot contact falling right under center of mass here, and again here. Lovely foot contact through center of foot here in this running action or this striding action. Beautiful posture, a little bit piked at hips, but certainly foot contact still falling beautifully under the center of mass. Hip extension is another one that people often overemphasize. We really only need 8 to 14 degrees of hip extension. Any more than that, and athletes will try and overstride or overreach or overpush in the running action. So what happens then when we do extend the hip more is we tend to then lower hip height at toe off, okay, because the foot's staying on the ground and travelling further behind us until we get to toe off. And what that does is change the position and orientation of the pelvis into anterior tilt often, and leave our foot trailing behind us, so it's a lot longer lever and it's a lot harder to bring through into the next stride. And it also then lowers our hip height, which reduces our stride length. And by doing that, as mentioned before, that then the equal and opposite reaction to that is that we overstride or reach out on the front side to balance that longer lever at the rear action. This causes increased trunk rotation, as you can see here, and the abdominals are having to work really strongly to try and counter those rotations. We can see the tension that's built through the abdominals here in this example, and that obviously detracts from your energy availability for other aspects of the running gait. So really, by simply correcting overextension of the hip, we improve our running efficiency and we're less likely to cause ground-breaking forces on the opposite limb. So at constant velocity running, that might be just going for a jog or 6 meters per second or 5 meters per second or 4 meters per second. It might be running a marathon, or it might be the last phase of a sprint race in the last 40 meters of 100 or the home straight of a 200 meters. What we really want to see here is just a nice long straight line of drive. We want to see hip height being maintained. We want to see the limbs start to align with our line of drive in our front shin and our forearm. And really, it's all about, at constant velocity, all we really need to do is maintain our momentum, maintain the current status quo of our velocity. We've got a little bit of horizontal forces acting on us in wind resistance, but we don't really need to generate a lot of backward foot action to overcome that horizontal force. Gravity pulling down on us is our greatest counter component. So we really need to be thinking about just generating from this top of the knee position here, pushing this foot straight down onto the ground so it lands directly underneath the knee, and obviously momentum carrying the hip forward, and that foot contact ends up being directly under the center of mass. So really, often when athletes get to constant velocity, they're still trying to generate horizontal forces, and it's really quite unnecessary to do so. Once you're at constant velocity, it is just about maintaining that simply by having good trunk lean and providing downward forces, maintaining hip height so that you keep your flight phase and your stride length equal. What I love about the Gallipoli movie is the quote around, "What are your legs? They're steel springs." And this, for me, really is a beautiful model to apply to amputee running. Teaching amputees how to utilise their feet and their blades to use the energy that's stored within those is a great model to work with when teaching amputee gait and amputee running. Most of the time, amputees will want to use their limbs passively, and we really want to see that they actually are loading their feet actively. They're storing as much energy in them as possible so they get a beautiful rebound effect and get that spring effect. Because really what it's all about is creating ground reaction forces that give us spring and height. So for me, another lovely cue that I use is about bouncing. I'm trying to teach athletes that all of their movements need to be bouncy and springy. It promotes posture, it promotes rigidity, it utilises the elastic energy contributions, it maintains elastic energy within the musculoskeletal complex, promotes good down forces and vertical releases. Just simply by thinking about bouncing, you end up applying more forces on the ground and get this lovely rebound up and vertical into the air. It promotes our stretch shorten cycle and really does maintain the position of the pelvis so that cadence can be optimized and so that forces can be aligned in the direction of travel. So Wayne's research, again, as mentioned before, really talks about this high knee top position here. And it's about driving the foot straight down onto the ground from this high knee position that creates an early in the running support phase that creates the difference between good runners and great runners. And what I find is when we achieve this and we really push down and strike down hard with this front side foot onto the ground, not only do we get good vertical ground reaction forces in a vertical direction, but we also get a beautiful rebound effect of our trail limb. So this lovely concept of action-reaction. So if I'm driving and striking this foot down from this top knee position here, really down into the ground, what we tend to have as the counter effect is this leg here bouncing beautifully back up into the next stride. So this action-reaction scenario and this reflex of elasticity really occurs beautifully when we cue this in the early support phase. So in terms of prosthetic setup, possible considerations that we need to think about is obviously the height and the length of the limb, the category of the foot, the socket and the suction that might be utilised, the alignment, some of the componentry that's used, and the type. You know, we've got a heap of variety of limbs and feet to use and to choose from, and the type of suspension as well. All these things here will impact on some of those mechanical constraints that we talked about earlier. So how does it affect setup? If we're in a team sport and sprinting, for example, there's more acceleration required in team sports and in 100-metre or 200-metre sprinting. So a 100-metre race might have 40 to 50 metres of acceleration. So therefore, the angle to the ground is a little bit greater for a larger component of the event than, let's say, a 10K fun run or going for a jog. So what we might need here is a little bit more toe involved. And we can see here that this athlete here has actually manipulated their blade and created a little block under the toe of their blade to give them a little bit more support in this 45-degree position so that toe is available to them to generate force and power. Again, here we can see that there's quite a good length of toe left on the blade here so that we can see that he can utilize that in accelerating. Marcus here is predominantly a long jumper who would normally start his long jump run up from a standing position. So here, coming out of blocks, we can see that his toe is really quite short and that he doesn't have a lot of area to purchase from or to generate power from. This, in a running sense, from his long jump run up, he's probably at a higher angle. He's probably coming off a standing start at maybe 60 degrees. So therefore, that toe is probably fine in a long jump scenario. But here, coming out of blocks, in this particular usage of this foot, he's probably a little bit shy in terms of toe length to generate good forces and good balance in this setup. The faster you run, the greater the leg cadence and the greater ranges at the hip and knee that are required. So the socket and suspension system need to maximize knee flexion, and this is called the figure of four position. And this is really what identifies as some good technique, is that at full support, when we've got heel down, all of our weight on our grounded foot, we want to see this lovely four shape where the knee is forward, the knee is flexed high, and the heel is coming and traveling up underneath the buttock. If we don't achieve this or we don't have this ability to get this knee flexion, then our symmetry is altered and we end up with a lower heel height, and our body has to compensate for this lower reaction, lower flexion, and we end up with increased rotation and having to balance that with arms and trunk to correct. So the other thing that happens when we run faster, the faster you run, the less time you spend on the ground. So greater body weight forces acting at each contact, so up to 8 to 10 times the body weight depending on how fast you're running. So this has implications for the category or the stiffness and also the height of the limb. At fast speeds, we don't need a lot of toe length because we're in an upright position, but obviously, you've got to accelerate. So if you're trying to accelerate in a short period of time, then you might need more toe. But if you're just gradually building up to a fast speed, like a 400-metre race, then you may not need as much toe length in that scenario. So the suspension here, though, is pretty critical, and the range of motion that you can achieve through the knee flexion is quite important at fast speeds, because we're capable of generating around 300 degrees per second of angular momentum around the knee and hips. So it's quite important to have that ability to flex the knee to allow that speed. At slower speeds, running a marathon, you spend more time on the ground and less time accelerating. You're at constant velocity more often, so you really don't need a lot of toe, and you're spending a lot more time in an upright posture. So we may need just a softer foot to compensate for some of the vertical loading, to absorb some of those forces. We really don't need as much toe, and we're not going to compress the foot as much because we're not traveling as fast. So there's only probably 2 to 3 times body weight through each foot contact. So we may not need the stiffness in the category at slower speeds. In team sports, we spend a lot more time decelerating and changing direction. And these scenarios are really driven by our heels and toes. So we can see in this image here, we're really generating some forces off the toe here. But if this foot was to come down onto the ground, it's really going to be a heel strike. So our change of direction and our ability to accelerate and decelerate really does come off our heels and our toes. So in terms of a setup there, we might need a different type of foot that actually has a heel or a bit of a longer toe to enable us to achieve the positions and postures and to change direction or accelerate and decelerate more frequently in team sports. How do I assess success? Really, we're looking at symmetry and ground contact times. For me, this is the main thing that I know we have a good setup for amputee running, and I measure this normally with just a digital video camera or my phone, and I'm just counting the frames. So how many times are we on the ground? We're on the ground 11 frames on the left side, and we're on the ground 8 frames on the right side. I would try and teach and cue the athlete and review the setup until we get something that's a little more closely symmetrical in terms of ground contact times. When looking front on, I want to see that we've got nice shoulder and hip positions that are symmetrical and parallel, unlike Neil here in this image. But the shoulders are square, the hip height is balanced at full support phase, that we're not getting any deviation or lateral deviation. We're not getting too much shifting of our limbs. The arm here is a little wide away from our center of mass, and the knee here as well, drifting a little wide from the center of mass. You can see here, even on Kelly's image, we've got elbow a little bit wide and knee swinging a little bit wide as well. So we want to really try and pull those in tighter to the center of mass. From side on, I want to see that there's nice hip height, really good hip height maintained that increases our stride length. There's a strong line of drive from our toe off position all the way through knee, hip, shoulder and ear. And there's a really strong projection up and forward when we run. We also want to see good trunk lean, not over leaning, but just a nice trunk lean and nice long line of drive here. It's beautiful from ear through shoulder, through hip and through knee. Really nice postures and positions. We also want to see from side on that the foot contact is landing underneath the center of mass. Excuse me. And we also want to see that we can hit this beautiful in full support phase, a figure of 4 position. From behind, we also want to see lovely shoulder positions, balance with the pelvis, and that at full support, we're not getting a real shift in lateral hip movement. And the last thing to look at here is the heel recovery height the same on the left and right limbs? Things that are other telltales is elbow width. So if elbows are traveling a little bit wide in the running action, then we often will have rotations, and ponytail swings for the girls is obviously a sign that we've got increased rotation traveling from the lower limbs all the way up through the spine and into the head. And that's a key giveaway that we've got some inadequacies in our running economy and efficiency. Looking at foot collapse, knee collapse, and hip collapse in these scenarios as well. Some of the drills that I do, and I'll make these available on the website for you. We start with predominantly just really simple walking drills, teaching amputees about their posture, about where to place their feet so that they're underneath their center of mass, and also some real protective mechanisms for the non-affected limb by creating some good strength through the gastrocnemius and the soleus muscles to prevent injury and to tolerate training loads. So we do things like tiptoe walking, we do heel to toe marching where we strike with the heel and then we lift up onto the toe before progressing into the next walking step. We do side to side crab walks, we do straight leg walks, and we do karaoke walking just to create some awareness of where the foot is and to increase some rotation and just to be able to provide a counter and correct the trunk and core and teach it how to balance rotations. And then we progress to skipping and marching drills, single leg drills, and some down, down, down on the cone drills, which you all should be able to see from the videos once we get them online for you. And then one of the other favorite drills I do is a 10-10-10, where we set up 3 cones 10 meters apart. And we start with just little running actions where we're running over the height of our ankles. So small, really small circle strides over the top of our ankles, the next stride over the top of our shins, and the next zone over the top of our knees. And it just creates this lovely mechanism of increasing our stride, length, and height as we go. And when we get this all done and completed, what we see is beautiful symmetry in postures. We perform the same as our peers, that we end up seeing a lot more similarities than differences in amputee performances. Our abilities on the field are very similar. We get to compete against our peers. We may become a champion. We may compete for medals. Or it might just simply be enjoying a run or a game with friends. So thanks everybody for listening. Thanks to the Össur team and thanks to Peter Brown, who's my video model.